Our next presentation comes to us from Strathcona County, Alberta. Please join me in welcoming Neil Bjorklund and Lex Robertson.
Hello and good afternoon, everybody. We're here today to talk to you about our digital workplace transformation, which is our journey from using folders and papers to metadata and electronic records using Office 365. You'll notice that there are two of us up here today. This is no mistake. Neil's here representing our IT team, and I'm here representing our information management branch. This was a joint-led project where both teams had an equal vote and an equal stake in the outcome. As she mentioned, we are from Alberta. Please don't hold it against us. We'd much rather be your wilderness area. It's beautiful here. For those of you not familiar with Alberta, we're a lovely region to the east of that place with the hockey team. You may have heard of them, the Oilers. And we have just under 100,000 citizens in a main urban area called Sherwood Park and a range of farmland, hamlets, and other areas. 55% of our landmass is actually the Beaver Hills UNESCO site, so we're a leader in environmental conservation, and we do 75% of the hydrocarbon processing for Western Canada. So again, please don't hold the Alberta thing against us. Most of our project happened before my time, so I'm actually going to hand you over to Neil for this first part.
So what is the Digital Workplace Transformation Project? It is making the information you need to do your job available to you on your phone or your PC, wherever you might be working. To do this, we were moving all content from within our OpenText Enterprise Content Management System and our shared network drives into Office 365 Modern SharePoint. And during this, we transformed all folders into metadata. Our initial project approach was a 3-week engagement with each department. It was a 7-step process that was influenced by both information management as well as IT. We started with reviewing existing content, understanding the group structure of each department, designing new sites, cleaning up old content, and mapping content from OpenText and network drives into SharePoint. This was the heavy lifting IT part. We then migrated all the content over a weekend, trained staff, and went live. The initial project had OneDrive and Teams out of scope as we felt the learning curve of SharePoint was too big. All project work was to be outsourced to a consulting team, and our team would provide guidance and post-implementation support. To ensure that our approach was a good approach, we did a pilot. But what we didn't realize is that our pilot went a little too perfectly. Our Economic Development and Tourism department volunteered for our pilot, and they were the perfect department. They allowed us to lock them in a room for a week, during which time they made no change to any of their content. We trained them to design libraries and metadata, and they helped us build a mirrored folder structure of these new libraries and metadata on their network drive, so that moving the content during this time, so that when we did the migration into SharePoint, it was essentially a lift and shift where we lifted it from the network drive and shifted it into SharePoint, and it went perfectly. And so we trained them the Monday morning, and everything was perfect for all 10 of them. So now that we had one way to rule them all, we started our project. And with our first department, we discovered there was darkness in our one way. First of all, the department could not be locked in a room for a week. They were busy working, and they just couldn't dedicate the time towards us. Then we discovered they had both content within OpenText and the network drive, where our Economic Development and Tourism only had a network drive. The contractor's approach that needed the department staff to move content was extremely labor intensive because they had to move content and wait for it to move. So it took a lot of time and this department didn't have time to do that. So while in the end this implementation was successful, we were not satisfied and we changed our approach. Our team became heavily involved in all parts of the project, including I became the technical lead. We scaled up the team by contracting individual resources to fill specific roles like business analysts and technical analysts. The 7-step process, which was very important, we determined that the internals of each step had to be flexible, and that was specific to the analyst on the project and the client department we were working with. We realized that a department of 10 staff was very different from a department of 400 staff. So we adjusted the steps accordingly, engaged with specific resources and not everyone in those large departments. We removed the 3-week deadline and we moved to a 7-week, 1 week per step target. We created a less disruptive approach to mapping and moving content. We got business analysts to complete an initial mapping, and then they reviewed that with the department representatives, and this significantly reduced the time commitment on each of the departments. Once the process adjustments matured, we realized we had a technology challenge. Our original plan was to use migration solutions out of the box, ECM-wise to move content from OpenText to SharePoint, and ShareGate to move content from network drives to SharePoint. But remember when I said we changed our approach? As part of that change, we brought in Excel to make the mapping of migration less disruptive for staff and to make it possible to move from folders to metadata. And techies, please cover your ears. To make it all work, we use a number of Excel spreadsheets and a number of Excel macros. The solution was not pretty, but it worked really well. Any techies who want to dig deeper, please come see me after. I can share all the stories. You would expect a project like this to have your typical project manager. Unfortunately, this one didn't, and not because we didn't try. Our manager started off as the project manager of the pilot, but when the project officially started, we hired a project manager. The challenge was we already scheduled our first department, and the project manager wanted us to stop and do more planning and turn the lightweight artifacts done for the pilot into formal PMI compliant artifacts. Since we weren't prepared to stop, we let that project manager go. And we tried again. Same results. In total, we went through at least 5 project managers. And they were all good project managers. Some of them we'd worked with before. The problem is they were not comfortable with the pace of the project and the level of adaptation that each client required. And then this is when Lex started, and we made her take over the role. And this is another example of just how involved in the project each of our team members became.
So it's late 2019. We've got a plan, we've got a team. I'm feeling good. It's gonna be great, right? 2020 rolls around and what plan? It goes over like a tower of Jenga. So we had to figure out what we're gonna do. Well, we ended up with several impacts. We needed to have my temporary PM hat look a little more permanent, which I was not ready for. We needed to have Teams training to get people using it for meetings and phone calls. We needed to get OneDrive going so they could work from home. We had to adjust the onboarding training to split between all 3 technologies. And we had to do all of that while still somehow moving forward. So we did a lot of learning fast and failing forward. Training became a huge component. It was now 1 FTE, all on its own, all the time. We had the right team, by which I mean everybody had a very dedicated role. There was an OCM person, a BA, an information management analyst, and an IT analyst on every client's work, multiple clients at the same time. We had equal voices. Everybody could veto a client proceeding. So if there was a technical glitch, Neil would call it off. If there was an OCM challenge, they or our trainer would call it off. If I, as the PM, had to veto, it was normally a veto of You're there, Vito. We were going forward anyways, and we were all going to do our best. Good enough. So perfect became the enemy. Perfect is the enemy of the good. Good enough had to be good enough to go because it was COVID. People had to keep working, and we had to keep rolling. So our done didn't quite look the way we anticipated. What done ended up as. Just going back over to Neil for a minute.
Yeah, so what our done did look like was just over 1,500 SharePoint sites, just under 5 million documents migrated. Our department archives ended up being a little larger than we had initially expected, and this is primarily due to the good enough approach when we were cleaning up legacy content. All departments were migrated off OpenText by mid-2021 and their access removed. By January this year, we had OpenText turned off, and by March, we deleted the OpenText servers. For network drives, access was removed after each department implementation, but that didn't always go quite as expected, and I'm going to let Lex share those details.
So as the GIS folks in the crowd can attest, GIS files really like their network storage if you're not already in a cloud implementation. So taking away department network analysts' GIS drives did not go as planned. So we still, in fact, have some drives we haven't finished cleaning up yet. We're doing a cloud implementation with them, and they should be done by the end of the year, I hope. But speaking of ends of years and looking back, as with all good project managers, I love my charts. So our bottom graph line is the original 3 weeks per department we're going to get her done timeline. Something happened in the middle of that, big, round, red, spiky, affected everybody. And it puts a big gap in our beautiful little project line, during which everybody in the team was tools down, training up. We were still engaging with stakeholders across the organization. We just weren't doing migrations. Once we got to resume migrations, however, we pretty much did okay. There is a 9-month difference between our original timeline and our post-COVID timeline. And that was okay, given all the challenges we faced. So as you can see, we had some challenges and some factors. In the end, we had an insane 6 implementations in a 5-week period. So we talk about being realistic in our project planning and not burning out our staff. This project was not a great example of that.
That was a rough November.
You were on vacation for half of it. What are you talking about?
I was only on vacation for a couple of days, but we resourced up, so as the technical lead, I could be away for a couple of days, and it kept going during our busiest month.
So we had a good team, and it's one of our major lessons learned. So our big takeaways is that no matter how perfect the process, and no matter how perfect the technology our IT partners bring us, the people factor will end up ruling the day and making the difference. Having a solid team meant we were able to adapt, we were able to learn fast and fail forward successfully. We ended up with a bit of a revolving door on BAs our first couple of times, much similar to PMs, in order to create the correct team to get us to success. Neil, what are your favorite lessons learned?
Yeah, for me, the biggest lesson we learned was good enough. When it came to cleaning up old content, you had to make a decision when you'd done enough cleanup. When you were designing sites, departments would want to design and redesign and redesign. You just had to say, no, it's good enough. And even when it came to mapping, yes, we want everything put in the proper place, but perfect is just unattainable. So you had to pick this magic good enough and go. And that really made a big difference. Once you weren't striving for perfect, you could find good enough.
I am going to say that we did come back and do what we called productivity engagements with each of our stakeholder departments as people returned to the office. It was 3 weeks of retraining and rejigging the parts of their sites that weren't working for them, that had been designed in a rush during the work from home part of our existence, and are now adjusted to their everyday lives. So our big learnings and our big innovations is no matter how perfect the technology, cover your ears, people are the difference maker for our work. So thank you all very much. And we're hopefully going to hear the questions. What else did you wish you had learned from us?
I'm just curious on high level how you guys deal with the metadata entering. questions for the project, like how the users enter their metadata for the files.
Yeah, go ahead.
So when the BAs were working with the clients, they designed an information architecture which said that for this library, we want the following tags. The BA would then enter that into one of Neil's magical spreadsheets. And during the migration, the spreadsheet would actually tell the engine to apply the tags for the users. So the users didn't actually tag any content themselves. They said, what was this folder is now this tag or these sets of tags in the new world. Neil's magic macros made a huge difference.
Yeah, everything was controlled by, a main information architecture Excel spreadsheet that specified here's what your sites would look like. And then we just made a user-friendly mapping sheet with drop-downs so that when it came to mapping, you said this folder location gets this metadata. So it did mean if you had two different pieces of content within one folder, you had to separate that. But for the most part, that worked really well. And in the end of our migrations, we had only one that has folders, and that's because that's our finance department and they're implementing an ERP system right now. So we said, okay, we'll be nice to you. You can use this for now. And then we're coming back to them next year to finish them off just because ERPs are kind of big.
So eventually we'll be folder free and we're really looking forward to that day.
Just a couple questions. One was around QC. Did you guys have to worry about, when you're migrating a large number of documents to make sure that you don't miss any in the integrity of them? And then the other question was around the speed of the migration tool. Was it sufficient? Was it, you migrated a lot of content, so I imagine there was some waiting around while the tool ran and you're running it overnight kind of thing? Just curious.
Yeah. So quality control, we did checks on everything. So everything that came over, we did a double check. Now we didn't open the content to double check it. It was still an Excel that opened properly. We trust the tools for that. Migration weekends were complicated. We typically had one resource dedicated to migration weekend. We would run a export on the Friday, typically the Friday night, but sometimes the department would give up the Friday for work and give us the Thursday night if it was a really big migration. Migrations could take anywhere between about 10 hours to 35 hours of work in a weekend. When we migrated our Recreation, Parks and Culture department with 500,000 documents, we were running 3 migration servers. We were running, I think it was 400 migrations into different libraries. And what we would do is we would run those all in sequence. And so we also utilized ShareGate allows you to script them. So we would pre-plan it all, and then you just run these large scripts of multiple library imports, and then you do your validation. When it came to migrating, a large portion of the work is actually to validate that the tools work properly and that your counts are good and there weren't errors. But yeah, it was, these weekends were long weekends. I did a lot of them to start, and then we hired more resources, which meant that I didn't have to give up my weekends. Most weekends were not a 35-hour weekend, but that was like from end of day on Friday at work to Sunday night. It was, 14, 15-hour days to just get it done.
And then Monday was training with the clients, go lives, remediations, and our techies ended up with a lot of Tuesday weekends.
Yeah. The only way to get a bit of rest was to take a Tuesday off, because Monday you were dealing with any little surprises, typically stuff like maybe a security group wasn't set up properly or little things. Yeah. Other questions? Oh, the one up front.
Great presentation. I may have missed it. What was the big drivers from going from OpenText to SharePoint?
I'll take that one.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So the OpenText implementation we had was legacy. It was due for a major upgrade. So we had missing records management modules, we had legacy servers, we had legacy databases, we had legacy network storage, it was coming up for, I want to say, a $500,000 bill.
It was a little over $500,000 to upgrade it to get up to a certain level of supportability.
And our infrastructure team was already converting our user licensing and Exchange to the online editions. We were moving to the Microsoft 365 cloud. We did end up with an adjustment to our records plan after this happened. We've ended up with a third-party tool to fill that gap, so. Money, that's with all things, money.
So my question is, coming from OpenText, obviously very mature enterprise EDRMS, and so yeah, moving to M365, were there some major holes? I know you just kind of alluded to a third party to fill some gaps, but could you tell us about that EDRMS transition to M365?
Well, there's a couple of challenges in that bucket. I'll start with the easy one. Our third-party tool is CollabSpace for records management. So we are making sure that there are legally defensible certificates for vital records for the organization. Think, Neil?
I'm just going to jump in. So I was actually part of a project that implemented OpenText back in 2012, and we'd previously been utilizing group-wise document management. Was never intended for clients. It was something that Novell developed themselves, and then we started using it. When we moved to OpenText, we did a lift and shift. So we moved all the folder structure from the group-wise document management and dropped it into OpenText. And we had a rough implementation with OpenText where we went with version 10, no service packs. And so it basically stopped our implementation of records management. And so we actually weren't really going from an ERMS. It was a document managed storage system. And so when we were looking at, why SharePoint instead of OpenText, we wanted all the accessibility features. We wanted to be able to work from anywhere. And OpenText was going to be too much effort to get us there for what it was providing, considering we didn't have the records management stuff configured. If we'd had records management behind the scenes, I think it could have been a different decision.
That's true. I also think that we want to factor in usability. We had a lot of client departments that weren't comfortable with OpenText and the restrictions necessary for records management inside of it. Users wanted to be able to delete their own files when they'd uploaded a picture of the dog instead of a picture of the dig site by accident. And OpenText wasn't supporting that level of trust but verify in our organization. Yep. So SharePoint's filling a few of those gaps for us as well.
As a result of that rough implementation back in 2012, we still probably had about 7 or 8 departments that didn't store a single thing in OpenText. And hence why we made sure we removed network drives at the same time. So we've kind of forced them into SharePoint.
There are definitely departments that curse our name. It's true.
You mentioned moving to metadata. I'm curious, what level of work your staff has to do in creating new records in terms of entering metadata, whether there's been any pushback on additional work required?
Change is always hard for staff, so there was definitely pushback. The level of pushback is varied depending on the champions in a given department and how good a job they did reflecting their teammates' needs. So for some departments, it was extensive, the work we did during the productivity and remediating. And for others, they set up a structure that worked for their processes that allowed them to drag and drop, to tag files. And that was probably one of our biggest wins for a lot of areas. They could grab the email attachment that came from a vendor, a client, their teammate, if their teammate was rejecting SharePoint, and drag it onto the metadata tag of question. And that meant they didn't have to tag it by hand. So anywhere we got complaints about it being too much work, we knew we'd missed something in the design and we had to go back.
We also have heavily utilized views. So your metadata turns into, it kind of looks like a folder structure for them within their libraries. And that's kind of how we've got around some of those challenges. And as part of the migration, we did bring over all that metadata. So we didn't make them tag after the fact. And our site owners, so within each department, we have the site owners, and we allow them to add metadata as they need. So they do, for the most part, take care of it themselves. There are some people that still come back to us, and we're glad to help them add metadata or add new libraries or do whatever they need.
As with all things, technology maturity in the departments varies.